Hot spots to watch. What crises could explode in 2021? The world was on lockdown for most of 2020. But from the Caucasus to the Horn of Africa to the Himalayas, several conflicts, some frozen for decades, erupted in violence. With the coronavirus pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, tensions that have simmered are threatening to flare up further in 2021. Especially as humanitarian need skyrockets, governments and aid groups face budget shortfalls, and climate change increasingly forces folks to flee or fight over resources. Here are the top conflicts or issues that could burst into all-out crises in 2021. Nuclear arms race, from rogue states to regional tensions at the start of 2020. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists made a dramatic announcement. Its famed doomsday clock was the closest to midnight it's ever been. With the threats of nuclear war and climate change growing ever more acute, national leaders have ended or undermined several major arms control treaties and negotiations during the last year, creating an environment conducive to a renewed nuclear arms race, to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and to lowered barriers to nuclear war, the group said in January. 12 months later, the last nuclear arms control pact between the U.S. and Russia is weeks from expiry, with no plans to extend it in sight. China continues to develop its nuclear arsenal, possibly even doubling it in the next decade, according to the Pentagon. It's also clashed high in the Himalayas with its nuclear-armed neighbor India, which in turn spilled blood with nuclear-armed rival Pakistan over the disputed territory Kashmir, as the global infrastructure to constrain nuclear weapons wanes. Any one of these could turn into a flashpoint next year. And that's without even mentioning the rogue nuclear power states North Korea and Iran, both of which are likely to test the incoming Biden administration. More. Joe Biden's top foreign policy challenges in 2021. After 4 years of President Donald Trump's policies, North Korea has more nuclear weapons and enhanced ballistic missile capability, which it may show off with a test launch early in President-elect Joe Biden's term to try to garner some attention and leverage, according to analysts. While the likelihood of a fire and fury response will diminish after Trump's departure, the risk of a skirmish spiraling into all-out war remains real. According to analysts, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and says it won't pursue them. But it once again has a stockpile of enriched uranium and a host of spinning centrifuges that decrease its so-called breakout time to potentially develop the bomb, according to nuclear experts. Analysts expect its forces, under disguise or through proxies, could resume attacks in the Persian Gulf region to build leverage ahead of possible negotiations with Biden's team, risking conflict with U.S., Israeli, or Arab forces. Terrorism threat expands, seizing instability across Africa on the campaign trail. Trump and his senior advisors repeatedly celebrated the defeat of ISIS's so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria. But since then, the terror threat has dispersed, with fighters and weapons flowing out of shrinking ISIS territory to new pockets around the world. More. At debate, Pence said Trump team bringing justice to ISIS guards. Under Obama, he called such moves naive, dangerous across Africa in particular, the world's youngest and fastest-growing continent. ISIS affiliates are now gaining strength, especially in Nigeria, Mozambique and the Congo, although a few terrorism experts caution some claim to be more powerful than they are in reality. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, sub-Saharan Africa's largest country, the Allied Democratic Forces, a decades-old militant group, has traded claims of responsibility for deadly attacks with a local ISIS affiliate. The fighting compounds the deep hunger crisis there, with more than 19 million people in need, according to the International Rescue Committee, which reported that DRC now has more people facing a severe hunger crisis than has ever been recorded in any country. In Mozambique, Islamist militants linked to ISIS have conducted brutal attacks in the northernmost province Cabo Delgado, including beheading more than 50 civilians in November and temporarily seizing control of a port in August. The deteriorating security situation has displaced more than 500,000 people, according to the UN Refugee Agency (UNHCR), with continued violence likely to bring more acute humanitarian need next year. The situation is perhaps worse, however, in the Sahel, the semi-arid region that spans northern Africa just south of the Sahara Desert, and that has seen a sharp rise in extremist groups and fighting. In Mali and Niger, the security situation is at best shaky, with the military junta trying to stabilize Mali amid inter-communal and jihadist violence and tense elections this week, and Niger leaving the path ahead uncertain, but hopeful. But Burkina Faso, the landlocked country twice the size of New York, has become the world's fastest-growing crisis. Over 1 million people have been internally displaced in just 2 years, according to UNHCR. And there is no end in sight of fighting between the government, militia groups and terrorist organizations, boosting the risk of famine for its 20 million people. Nigeria, the region's powerhouse and Africa's most populous country, is facing all the same trends with even deeper implications for global security. Its northeastern corner has been a hotspot for over a decade, with jihadist group Boko Haram and criminal violence terrorizing and displacing millions of civilians. But Nigerian armed forces' response has been cast as failing. And the government also faced sharp criticism for its heavy crackdown on anti-police brutality protests, signs that the state itself is increasingly unstable, which could create more chaos in 2021. More. Senior U.S. delegation meets with Nigeria's vice president after killing of #and SARS protesters. Peace efforts fail. Crises worsen in Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Yemen have been torn apart by conflict for years now, but 2021 could bring even deeper suffering for civilians in both countries. In recent months, while Afghan government and Taliban delegations sit in luxury hotels in Doha, Qatar, for peace negotiations, there has been a spike in car bombings, rocket fire, targeted attacks on police and security forces, botched Afghan Air Force bombings, and assassinations of government officials, activists and journalists, compounded by coronavirus, that has kept Afghanistan's already victimized civilian population in continued danger, even after decades of humanitarian need. The peace negotiations were supposed to aim for a nationwide ceasefire as soon as possible, according to the U.S. Taliban deal signed in February, but the militant group has resisted so far, using violence as leverage in talks. But if the violence is sustained into 2021, it could imperil negotiations and ignite into all-out conflict, just as U.S. troops draw down out of the country and the ISIS franchise claims more deadly attacks more frequently, according to Afghan officials and U.S. analysts. Yemen has similarly faced years of stop-and-start peace efforts, but with coronavirus raging through the country with no healthcare system to track it, let alone treat it. The world's worst humanitarian crisis is expected to descend even deeper in 2021. After 5 years of endless fighting, humanitarian funding is drying up, leaving approximately 80% of the population in need, according to aid groups. The UN-mediated effort has stalled, with the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition fighting in its own ranks as much as with the Iran-backed Houthi rebels, and neither side has shown real interest in protecting civilians, let alone peace talks. One other near-decade-old conflict to mention is Syria, where murderous strongman Bashar al-Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, could test the incoming Biden administration by trying to finally seize control of the last pocket of rebels and jihadists in Idlib province, causing a bloodbath and pushing masses of Syrians fleeing into Turkey and beyond to Europe. East Africa erupting as violence spills over borders in the final few months of 2020. The Greater Horn of Africa experienced a flash of violence, often spilling over borders and threatening to suck in the whole region in the coming months. At the heart of it is Ethiopia, whose government went to war with well-armed political forces in its Tigray region. A conflict that continues to see sporadic fighting and claims of mass killings, and that could worsen ahead of 2021 elections. It may also suck in neighboring Eritrea, long at war with Tigrayan leaders and now partnering with federal forces against them, leading to cross-border rocket fire and aerial bombardment. Further endangering the region is the fact that the fighting sent tens of thousands of refugees scrambling into Sudan itself on a rocky transitional road to democracy after decades of oppressive rule. The two neighbors are already locked in a dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and occasional clashes along the border could inflame into another front line. Elsewhere in East Africa, Kenya and Somalia have cut diplomatic ties over Kenya's support for breakaway region Somaliland, heightening regional tension further. The move also means Kenya will likely pull its peacekeeping troops in Somalia, just as U.S. forces withdraw, leaving Somalia more vulnerable to al-Shabaab, a powerful al-Qaeda affiliate that will continue to plot attacks and increasingly conduct them abroad. In the midst of it all, the fragile semi-peace in South Sudan, the world's youngest country still emerging from civil war, faces catastrophic levels of hunger, according to the UN, if left unchecked much longer. A strategic region could devolve into war with itself and others, imperiling U.S. interests from the Red Sea to Europe, warned Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. COVID-19 political crisis sink Venezuela even lower, once one of Latin America's richest countries. Venezuela has been racked by Nicolas Maduro's corruption and mismanagement, but the political opposition's efforts over the last 2 years have not forced him from power. Parliamentary elections in December were boycotted by the U.S.-backed interim leader Juan Guaido and decried as fraudulent by most democracies. But they also pushed Guaido and many on his team from the legislature, leaving them with one less avenue of power. That political stalemate has increasingly splintered the opposition, which could lead to more radical voices emerging, sick of Maduro's intransigence and seeking alternative means. Instead of a political settlement, Venezuela is likely to see more social unrest. particularly as coronavirus further sinks Venezuela's economy and causes food and fuel shortages, with 1/4 of the country's population in need, according to IRC. But the danger could also become one for the region. Despite COVID shutting borders, Venezuelan refugees continue to escape the country. But their growing presence, almost 2 million in Colombia and nearly 900,000 in Peru alone, according to the UN, are starting to destabilize neighbors. This fall, Colombia has already seen protests and attacks on Venezuelans, who are blamed for rising crime or unemployment, which could escalate as COVID-19 further damages local economies. Assertive China gets punched back while the coronavirus emerged from Wuhan and threatened to overwhelm China. Its draconian lockdown has allowed Beijing to emerge more quickly than other major powers, rebooting its economy and taking advantage of the world's paralysis with increasingly assertive moves. More pro-democracy lawmakers resign in Hong Kong's darkest day. So far, in Hong Kong, democratic protests have faded under COVID-19 restrictions. But particularly after China's national security law tightened its control on the territory. While protests could re-emerge in 2021, the tale of the city now is of asylum seekers fleeing and activists incarcerated elsewhere. China is likely to keep flexing its new muscles, asserting firmer control over now militarized islands in the South China Sea despite U.S. opposition, and seeping its control across international boundaries, such as the disputed border with India's Ladakh region, continued claims against Japan's Senkaku Islands, and land grabs in Nepal and Bhutan, two tiny neighbors. But these new moves could be met with clashes in 2021 as regional powers push back, often with increasingly vocal American support. India has banned Chinese apps and boosted its military spending and border troop presence, and Japan's defense minister said China had become a security threat, both countries joining the U.S. and Australia under the Trump administration's revitalized Quad format. Nowhere is the tension fiercer than in Taiwan, considered by Beijing a breakaway province that must eventually be reunited. Taiwan is likely to face more harassment from China's Navy and Air Force after they upped their tempo this year. That was met by record-breaking arms sales to Taiwan by the Trump administration, totaling $18.3 billion over 4 years and including elite fighter jets and advanced torpedoes. With a Biden administration focused on issues at home, China could take the ultimate risk of forcing reunion by the barrel of a gun, which analysts fear but say remains unlikely. 2020 was meant to be the year of climate action. Instead, it crowned a wasted decade. 2020 was supposed to be the watershed moment for action on climate change. The year the world woke up to the challenge and started taking it seriously. Instead, it has symbolically topped a decade of wasted climate promises. Inspired by a wave of climate activism, national leaders were expected to come up with new, more ambitious plans for how to cut emissions over the next decade. The COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland, was going to be the first real test of their determination to do what they had promised to. Under the landmark Paris Agreement, the coronavirus pandemic has derailed those plans, giving some governments a new excuse to stall. But COVID-19 definitely hasn't stopped climate change. 2020 has brought near constant reminders of the severity of the crisis we face. A record-breaking Atlantic hurricane season, the most devastating wildfires in recent history, and droughts, deadly floods and heat waves that swept through communities worldwide, leaving death, destruction and disruption in their wake. The pandemic has also showed the world that big, previously unthinkable changes are possible. Despite the global upheaval, several of the world's largest polluters did raise their long-term climate goals, putting the world within striking distance of the Paris Agreement's goal to reduce emissions and so limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Experts are cautiously optimistic. There's now a recognition that when the world's main economies are minded to They can intervene and correct these market failures, said Mike Davis, CEO of Global Witness, an NGO that focuses on human rights, climate and the environment. We've seen this to some extent in response to COVID, and perhaps that has begun to chip away at this myth that essentially we're all slaves to the free market. And there's nothing that we can do. Devastating impacts. The effects of climate change have become harder than ever to ignore in 2020. According to the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, 2020 is on track to become the third hottest year on record, after 2016 and 2019, and that's despite the cooling effect of La Niña. The period between 2011 and 2020 will be the warmest decade on record. But global warming is just one aspect of the climate crisis. The major impacts of climate change have been felt through drought, flooding, sea level rise, stronger tropical storms, hurricanes, typhoons and cyclones, and also melting of the glaciers. Petteri Taalas, Secretary General of the WMO, told CNN. In the first 6 months of this year, nearly 10 million people were forced from their homes by disasters that were either caused or worsened by climate change. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, IDMC. For some the move was temporary, but many are facing long-term displacement. India, Bangladesh and the Philippines were the three worst impacted countries, totaling more than 6 million displacements between them. Developing countries are often hit disproportionately hard by the impacts of climate change because of their location and the lack of access to the funds and technologies that could help mitigate the effects. But 2020 showed that no country is immune to such disruption. Hundreds of thousands of people from some of the world's richest countries were forced out of their homes, lost their livelihoods, and sometimes their lives because of fires, storms, and floods. An estimated 53,000 people in the US and 51,000 more in Australia were displaced in the first 6 months of the year alone. And wherever such disasters happen, the poorest still suffer the most. According to Alexandra Billick from the IDMC, even in high-income countries, in California for example, there are people who didn't have access to insurance and who did lose everything. And they're the ones we are particularly concerned about because they're the ones who are going to end up in very protracted situations where their vulnerabilities are going to increase, she said. Glimmer of hope. The effects of climate change were devastating in 2020, but they could become even more disastrous if global warming continues in line with current trends. The WMO says there is now at least a 1 in 5 chance that average global temperatures will temporarily exceed pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2024, a critical threshold in the Paris Agreement. Under the deal, most of the world agreed to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, and to aim to keep it to 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.2 degrees warming, and the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that for the welfare of mankind and also for the welfare of biosphere, the 1.5 degree target would be more favored, Taalas said. With the 2 degrees target, we would see more negative impacts of climate change. It would harm global food production capacity. There would be plenty of coastal cities that would suffer from sea level rise, and we would see more Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, typhoons and cyclones. Global greenhouse gas emissions need to fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 if there's any chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and by 25% to keep it to below 2 degrees, according to the IPCC. The good news, Taalas said, is that we have both the technological and economic means to reach those targets. The bad news? Most nations still haven't adopted concrete plans to get their emissions fell during spring's coronavirus lockdown, and the WMO estimates that, as a result, they will be between 4.2% and 7.5% lower this year compared to 2019. But the effect of the fall is negligible, because carbon stays in the atmosphere for a long time. The concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere surged to a new record high again this year. To reach the climate targets, emissions need to fall by at least the same amount, about 7.6%, each year over the next decade. There is a chance this could happen. Until recently, I guess everyone had been quite depressed about the way policies and actions were developing on climate change. Bill Hare, CEO of Climate Analytics, told CNN. Hare said there has been an understandable slowdown in action because of the pandemic. It seemed that political momentum was draining away, but in the last 6 or 8 weeks, particularly since September when President Xi Jinping of China announced China's move towards net zero emissions before 2060, the whole mood has changed. South Africa, Japan, South Korea and Canada have all announced new 2050 net zero targets, following pledges by China, the EU and the UK. And while the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement under President Donald Trump, the incoming Biden administration is widely expected to announce a new 2050 net zero target. According to analysis by the Climate Action Tracker, these new pledges put the world within striking distance of the Paris Agreement target. The Tracker, a partnership between the New Climate Institute and Climate Analytics, said current plans would translate into 2.1 degrees of warming by 2100. But the new pledges are just that, promises to achieve something in 3 decades' time, when most of the current governments will be long gone. The acid test is whether or not countries really will step up action in the near term for 2030, Hare said. The 2050 and 2060 targets are steps in the right direction and shouldn't be underestimated, but what really matters is what governments do now. The next decade will be the true make-or-break moment. Threats sparked by disinformation could spark real-world violence in Georgia. Activists say a spike in disinformation about the election process in Georgia has prompted online threats against officials, poll workers and campaign staff that activists fear could lead to real-world violence. The pivotal runoff races in the state, slated for January 5th, hold the power of the Senate in the balance and come in the wake of a deeply divisive election cycle. Georgia went for a Democrat in the presidential race by a slim margin, prompting unsubstantiated claims of widespread fraud and attacks on Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State, who stood by the integrity of the process. Researchers from Fair Fight Action, an activist group that promotes voter participation in Georgia and is chaired by Stacey Abrams, have tracked a large increase in disinformation related to the state's elections as conspiracy theories about the vote count promoted by President Donald Trump and his supporters have run rampant on social media. The post-election spike of disinformation and the consumption by Georgia voters of disinformation has been